I'd ask you to kind of hold your questions till the end if you can, and we'll hopefully get to it all. So we'll go ahead and get going here. Hopefully, Lee, help me out.
You get turned on.
There we go. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the honeybee and not about native bees. Okay, the honeybees are like the European or the Western honeybee. That kind of originated in Europe. Actually, they really think they might have originated in East Africa. But I'm not gonna be talking about native bees. There's about 20,000 different types of native bees in North America. About 1,600 different types of native bees just in California. All right, some terms. One term is a colony. A colony is it's all the bees. Okay, it's the queen, it's the workers, the drones, it's the brood, things like that. As opposed to the hive. The hive is the structure. It's where the bees live. That might be a tree, but it might also be like you see with beekeepers in boxes and things like that. And then swarms. Swarms are, you hear about swarms, and it's that mass that makes a lot of that noise, the bees flying around, and then they'll gather on a tree or a fence or side of a house or wherever. But that's how they kind of perpetuate the species and continue on. Very common thing. And this is swarm season right now. All right, a little bit about history. We'll go back. This depicts what was found in a cave back in the early 1900s in Spain, and it shows a human on a ladder digging into a cave. There's some insects flying around, and it's thought to have been a human, gathering honey out of a hive. So they were kind of hunting for honey. They're not beekeeping at this point for sure. And then the ancient Egyptians, this is maybe 3,000 years ago. Egyptians, there's stories of Egyptians that were moving bees down the Nile in clay pots and things like that. You hear about stories in the Bible. You've got in Exodus, the land of milk and honey, and Proverbs, they talk more about honey and honeycomb. Even Aristotle in 354 BC discovered that honeybees go out and they go to one type of plant at a time, and then they come back and deposit their pollen, and then they might go out to a different type of plant. But it's not like they go to multiple types of plants out on one initial flight. Okay, as kind of history goes on, you've got, getting into the Middle Ages and things like that. Beekeepers were, people were collecting swarms out of trees, out in the woods. They'd bring them back. They put them in different containers. And what's depicted here are some skeps. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But you can also see some depictions of starting to use equipment for protection and smoking to calm the bees and that sort of thing. This is back in kind of Revolutionary War days, and they used things called gums. Gums were like empty logs, sections of log, and they keep bees in that, or in skeps. Skeps were kind of the straw baskets, kind of the traditional looking thing that you might think of historically for beekeeping, but those might be made of straw and clay and that sort of thing. The problem with these types of arrangements was, anytime you wanted to get the wax or the honey out of them, you basically had to open it up and destroy the hive that was in there. And then the bees had to go put in a lot of energy to kind of recreate all that. Okay, so beekeeping comes to America, and I guess I've got step back here, or that's fine. Okay, yeah, I didn't want to mess up the video, but I guess the slides are more important than me. So we go back to kind of the New World, and back in 1621, a ship called the Discovery sailed and arrived in the New World. On the manifest was honeybees. So we know at least that's the first record of when honeybees got to the New World. And an interesting fact I picked up was that in 1663, this guy John Eliot, he was translating the Bible for Indians, but they could find no word for, the Indians had no word for honey or honeycomb, and so that kind of gave historians more insight that probably there were not any native honeybees in America at the time. So they made reference to the white man's fly and English fly and that sort of thing. They started to keep bees in boxes, but again, they're not managed. It's not like beekeepers today that were, actively managing beehives. These were, again, mostly destroyed, getting the honey and the wax and things like that. And yes, next here. All right, so the journey west. So as you know, 1848, after the Mexican-American War, then gold was discovered around that same time. And what happened was the Navy Congress directed the Navy, or authorized them to contract for ships to sail mail around the Cape Horn from New York to San Francisco, and this would bring mail as pioneers moved west, and they needed to communicate with mail and things like that. But by the time the first ship arrived in San Francisco, really arrived in Panama, where they picked up a whole bunch of passengers there that had heard about the gold rush. And in fact, the SS California was that first ship that went around to Cape Horn and eventually just sort of made the milk run between Panama and San Francisco. But it initially had supposed to have 210 passengers. By the time it picked up all its passengers in Panama, they had over 400 gold seekers that continued on to San Francisco. An interesting thing here that I want to tie in kind of to the local area was that one of the captains of the SS California was Captain James Thorne, and that was the father of Minnie Boone and the grandfather of Ruth Boone, and she's the one, of course, that gave us Forest Home Farms. I think when she died was in 1997 or so. And another interesting thing is that Captain Thorne also would later be a captain for the steamship route between San Francisco and the port of Alviso in the South Bay. And more on Captain Thorne and that route here in a moment. And that's a picture of what the SS California was. It was a three-masted steamship with a dual paddle, and was active for several years, delivering mail, not just mail and gold seekers, but also kind of going back to the East Coast. They'd go back with gold, gold and mail and other products that would go on to New York and the East Coast. So here we are now. How does it get to California? How do bees get to California? So, of course, our pioneer families in this area were here before the first honeybees. Mostly we had ranchers and farmers. The crops began to expand. Certainly there was a need for pollination. I'm not sure how much of that was understood at the time, but in 1853 was the arrival of the first honeybees in California. And most history give credit to a guy named Christopher Shelton. And I'm going to read, there's a plaque at the San Jose airport, and I'm going to read what it says here. Get my glasses on here. And it says, first bees in California. Here on the 1,939 acre Rancho Potrero de Santa Clara, Christopher A. Shelton, in early March 1853, introduced the honeybee to California. In Aspinwall, Panama, Shelton purchased 12 beehives from a New Yorker and transported them by rail, bongo, pack mule, and steamship to San Francisco. Only enough bees survived to fill one hive. So what's kind of interesting about this is that, first of all, Aspinwall is basically where Colón is in Panama. So it's on the Atlantic side of the Isthmus of Panama. And then At the time, of course, the Panama Canal didn't exist. The railroad didn't exist. They were building a railroad from the Atlantic to the Pacific side. But there was only about 23 miles built at the time, and so that's why they had to use things like mules and bongos. Bongos were dugout canoes. And so these bees were kind of made that journey across the Isthmus of Panama, picked up the one of the steamships, the SS California, got up to San Francisco, and those bees were transported by a ship called the Jenny Lind to the port of Valparaiso. They arrived in March of 1853. So there you see it, and it took 231 years to get basically from the East Coast in colonial times to California. Now, just another little tidbit here, the Jenny Lind, which transported those bees with Christopher Shelton, and he was a 27-year-old botanist, it had a boiler explosion just a month later that killed Christopher Shelton, and at the time of the explosion, Captain Thorne of Boone family fame was the captain of the ship at that time, but he survived. All right, so then beekeeping expands. You see here in 1855, there was a movement of about 53 hives, about 18 of those made it. And then a guy named John Harbison was probably the biggest beekeeper in California at the time. He had thousands of hives. You had the emergence of very large apiaries. Apiaries are places where beehives are kept. And then whereas Christopher Shelton and the first bees were German black bees, beekeepers or farmers and began to prefer the Italian bees. The Italian bees were a little more docile. They're better honey producers, and that sort of thing. And then there's some reference to some advertising about selling bees in Oakland. And yes, the Transcontinental Railroad came in. Of course, it didn't get into San Ramon until I think 1891 or so, but it did make it easier to move from the East Coast to the West Coast, and it was much more survivable for bees and quicker. And that's kind of where history starts to peter out. And can't find a whole lot of information between 1853 when bees first arrived and then the 30s, and I'll talk about that in a second. There is some reference in a book that John Muir wrote. He's got a chapter called The Bee Pastures. A lot of information about bees in there, but none of it specifically about the Bay Area. All right, so we're going to fast forward now to the 1930s and back to Ruth Boone and Forest Home Farms. Of course, the Depression is going on, and just one of the ways that she made a little extra money was having a fruit stand out front. So, and thank you, Beverly Lane. Here's an interview that she did with Ruth Boone. She says, "We had a fruit stand out front. We sold pickles, jams, salted almonds. We made quince, honey, orange, and grapefruit marmalade. I learned how to keep jam light. There were figs. We called them Travis Food Specialties. There was a Forest Home Farm, Forest Home label." Anyway, I thought that was interesting. So where did Beverly get the honey? Okay, no, I'm sorry, not Beverly, Ruth. Where did Ruth get the honey? And where did Beverly get the honey? So I see, saw in the docent guide over at Forest Home Farms, there's a quote in there that Ruth always remembers for 2 years in the 30s, some bees made their home inside the walls of the granary. Honey ran down the plywood walls, and she was able to collect the honey on metal trays. So I cannot find any reference to actual beehives at Forest Home Farms. So this is, my conclusion is this is where Ruth got the honey to sell out on Route 21 to get a little extra cash during the Depression. And then Bud Boone Travis, he also took some honey into Oakland and would sell it in there. Okay, so here's some local connections. I mentioned to some of you I was going to talk about some of these things, so we'll get on with that. So first is Doc Chapman. This is Grandpa Chapman to three of you in the room, right? And I got these pictures from the Wiedemann Family Archives, but this is Doc Chapman's truck in the center there. He's got a crane and a boom. That's how he moved the hives around. He managed hundreds of hives in the Tri-Valley. He painted them all silver, and not the truck as well was painted silver, as well as the hives. And then I was up at Roxy's place, and that picture in the lower center is one of the Doc Chapman's boxes, and it's still painted silver out in the shed on the property. And by the way, just for reference, Roxanne brought in Doc Chapman's smoker that he used from the 1930s time frame, as well as a can of his honey that he had. It's called Skyhaven brand honey. And sorry if I'm blocking it here. But yeah, who knows how old that really is, but it could be, what, 70, 80, 90 years old, I'm not sure. But Skyhaven Ranch was a ranch that Doc Chapman, I guess, had maybe owned down in Southern California. And I think, if I recall, Roy Rogers, lived there or operated from there for some time as well.
They were friends.
And friends. Okay. So here's a picture of kind of the San Ramon Valley in 1939, and so I'll point out a couple things here. So and you're all more of an expert than I am on some of this stuff here, but I see this as North Canyon Road right here. This would be like State Route 21 or San Ramon Valley Boulevard. That would have been Twin Creeks Drive. The Safeway is kind of in here today. But this is where the Norris house was that burned down in 1951. And then right here, about from kind of the stories I gathered, is where Doc Chapman's apiary would have been, where he kept his bees. Mm-hmm. So, and if I got that a little bit wrong, I'd love to kind of hear, fine tune that a little bit for those of you that kind of knew the Norris house and have actually seen that apiary. Okay. All right, now here's a picture, Bishop Ranch. I got this from Bishop Ranch, and I was talking to Alex Marin about beekeeping, and because they had the pear farm there that was first started in the early 1900s, went on to be the largest pear farm in the world. They say from what I've heard, but this area here is about where Doc Chapman's apiary is, the area in red. And then this area out in the middle of the farm, pear orchard, was One-Armed George's home. And there's not a lot known about One-Armed George. So one of the things that everybody agrees on, he had a lot of beehives all around the house. And so, certainly where Doc Chapman's apiary was, those bees could travel 2 to 4 miles or so to forage for pollen and nectar. So it's well within that range here. But these could have been Doc Chapman's hives out around One-Armed George's house as well. This is, of course, Inverness Park. So this picture might have been, 79, 80, 81 time frame as they were building out Inverness Park area.
So One-Armed George changed the transmission times.
It changed the transmission line?
The whole thing.
All right.
The
Just,
transmission.
All right.
Who's capable?
So I want to hear that story. So that's good. I'll build that. I'm kind of writing something up for Beverly Lane and the Museum of San Ramon Valley. I'm going to kind of write some stuff up, and I'd love to include another story there. I just can't find much on the good old One-Armed George. Okay, and then before I gave my presentation last year at Forest Home Farms, that was on, I think, July 27th last year. I talked to Don Wood, and he was a young boy in the 40s. I wouldn't call him a beekeeper. I mean, he was, the Wood Ranch wasn't about beekeeping, but he does have memories of some hives there on the Wood Ranch. And he said it was used for pollination of prunes and pears and almonds and things like that. And of course, he he passed only 2 weeks after, he was at that presentation,
Yes, he was.
and passed just 2 weeks later. And then, of course, no, Christian's not here tonight. We've got Roxy here, and then Brian and Haley Matthews. Excuse the spelling there. But they, Christian's got a couple hives. So does Roxy. Brian's captured some swarms, and he's got some hives now. And so it continues. And then Gilbert, and I can never pronounce his name. Pichot, Gilbert Pichot, was considered a local expert as well, and friends with Doc Chapman. But I tried to call him, but wasn't able to get through. So maybe more on that later. And when I did some research this week on the Mountain Diablo Beekeepers Association website, you can go in there, you can see who's registered with the club. We currently have 42 beekeepers that are in the club between San Ramon, Danville, Alamo. In fact, we've got one here with one yet. Okay. Well, then there's at least 43. But there's a lot of beekeepers who are not in the club, and especially San Ramon, because in San Ramon, it's not currently, the ordinances don't allow you to keep bees unless you have at least an acre of property. So we're trying to get that changed. Still working on that. Okay, so back to Forest Home Farms, and just another little tidbit here about Ruth and Travis here. Let me kind of turn to it. I think this was another quote from an interview with Beverly, I believe. Let's see, Ruth said, this is around holiday period, she's talking about holidays, and she says, "We were always too busy for other holidays. We would have a July 4th family dinner, and one July 4th day, a third of a huge old oak tree fell. Sap ran out of it like water. We had a man in Danville come, he was like a dentist. He drilled up the tree out, cleaned it out, and filled it with cement. That tree wrapped around the break, and all you can see is a scar. You can't even tell. And they grew over the top of the cement." So, but just kind of an indication that there were kind of feral bees around Forest Home Farms. And of course, for several years also, Steve Gentry, some of you may know Steve Gentry, he had a couple hives over at the farm. He was one of the owners of Steve's Bees. Steve's Bees you can still find in the markets locally. But although Steve passed in 2020. But again, there were some feral bees in an oak tree over at Forest Home Farms. In fact, Lionel McNeely, who is with the Historic Foundation, used to be in Public Works for San Ramon. He showed me a couple of the old trees where they've spotted bees in the past. And then this is from August of 2020. We had a huge windstorm in 2020, and it knocked over that beautiful big oak tree behind the barn. And so I got a call to come over and take a look, see if I couldn't get those bees, and had a bee vacuum, and we vacuumed up with the queen and the bees and captured them, and then kind of cleaned it up, gave all the honey and the honeycomb to the farm folks. And I kept that hive, and I still have that hive, or at least offspring of that hive. And so this is only a couple weeks ago, and the hive is in the background on the left, but they're doing okay. And so, the question I have is, were those from back in Ruth's day, maybe, that had swarmed into an oak tree? Were they from Steve's Bees? I'm working right now to try to get a couple hives back to the farm, and hoping the foundation will help me with that, and had some conversations on that this week, in fact. But would love to kind of keep that tradition going there. All right, now I'm going to transition out of the history stuff Again, not a whole lot on beekeeping specifically in the San Ramon Valley, but that's what I could come up with. So what is beekeeping? You know, is it a science or is it an art? And yeah, it's both. So, and a lot of it has to do with kind of the seasons. And you know, bees kind of slow down in the wintertime, then start building up in the spring and swarms and that sort of thing. You can harvest honey, you know, in the late spring, maybe in the fall again, and then they start to drop off again in the late summer. And so for beekeepers, you got to kind of figure out what do you want to do? Why do you want to be a beekeeper? What's your objective? Do you want to produce honey? Is it for pollination? It's a multi-million-dollar industry in California, out in the almond fields out in the valley. Or do you want to produce different products and things like that? So I'm just a hobbyist, you know, small amount, but there's some commercial beekeepers that have tens of thousands of hives that they manage. This guy, Reverend Langstreth, that really changed beekeeping, you know, modern day beekeeping. This is, again, 1852, so this is just before the time that the first bees arrived in California. And he kind of invented and patented a hive design that had movable frames in it. And that's the Langstreth type frames and everything is what most modern beekeepers are using today. And that's kind of what they look like. That's kind of him on the left, and then on the right is what one of these frames look like. And I hope you've had a chance to see, it's kind of like an ant farm, but it's the bees over here. And there is a queen in here, for those of you who haven't checked it out. Hopefully you'll get a chance to take a look at that. But that's two of those Langstreth type hives. And this is kind of how they're all put together. There's different sizes, 8 or 10 frame sizes. There's deep ones, there's medium size, and that sort of thing. But generally, you're going to have something to put them on, bottom board, boxes themselves, and then kind of some kind of a top cover. All right, a little bit about the honeybee itself. It's an insect, right? So it's got the 3 body parts. It's got the head, thorax, and the abdomen. Antenna, it's got 3 pairs of legs, 2 sets of wings. Flies have 1 set of wings, and then 2 compound eyes. And here's a picture of those eyes. The 2 compound eyes, and then the 3 smaller eyes. So really 5 eyes. And those additional eyes, they think, help the bees to see different wavelengths of light and maybe help with navigation and that sort of thing. But basically, they're in the dark almost all the time, so they gotta figure something out. So you might ask, how do they produce the wax and the honeycomb itself and that sort of thing? So they, on their abdomen, they've got wax glands, and they'll produce wax, and then they'll use their mandibles, which are kind of like pinchers in their jaws, to manipulate that wax and shape it to create the cells on the honeycomb. That's kind of what it looks like if they're just sort of left to their own devices there.
I have a question. What's the storage life on honey?
Well, the storage life is, some people say it's sort of indefinite. I've heard stories about getting honey from the Egyptian tombs that is still good honey even today. All right, and then you might ask, how do they bring the pollen and the nectar back to the hive as well? So on the bee's hind legs, rear legs, they've got some hairs, and as they go from flower to flower, they brush that pollen onto what we call honey baskets, affectionately, and then they bring that back to the hive. So, and that's a picture of a bee that puts a bunch of pollen onto the honey basket and getting ready to head home. And then as far as the nectar, the bee on the right looks a little bit swollen, a little bigger than the other one. The worker bees have a honey stomach, is what they call it, separate from their digestive stomach, and they use their proboscis, which is like a straw, to to draw out nectar out of the flowers, and they'll bring that back to the hive, and then put that into the various cells. Okay, and there's a bee doing just that. All right, so most of the bees you see out in the wild, most of the bees here in this hive, I've got the observation hive, they're pretty much mostly all worker bees. They're all female bees. You've got one queen, typically for a hive, and then just a small percentage of drones. I've heard reports of up to 10%. I'd say mine are more 1 to 2% drones in the hives. And they all go through this metamorphosis type process. So they go from eggs to larvae, like little caterpillars, little worms, to pupa, and then emerge as adults. And on the left, you can see, if you take a close look in there, you can see these little white things in there. That's how small the eggs are. They're difficult to see, but they definitely are visible when you take a good look and you get some contrast. They develop at different rates. The queen gets a little bit of extra royal jelly to make it develop the reproductive organs and what it needs to be a queen bee. The queens emerge a little bit sooner because of that. Worker bees about 21 days, drones about 24 days. And then the cells look different also. In this observation hive, I don't have any queen cells, fortunately. There's a queen in there. But the worker cells are a nice even pattern there in the center. And then down below, you see on the right side of the bottom picture, you can see some regular worker cells, but the other ones are drone cells. So it's almost the size of like a pencil eraser. So it's a little bit bigger for the male bees because they're definitely there. And kind of getting towards the end here, a little bit on queens. She's the only sexually developed female, and she can lay, some estimates are 2,000 eggs per day. So that might amount to about her own body weight every day. That's a lot. Tonight we were watching, and we watched the queen lay 3 eggs just before dinner. And then the worker bees, they don't live long, about 6 weeks. And for about the first 3 weeks, they're indoor bees, house bees. So they're doing all these tasks you see on the left. They're cleaning up the cells, they're feeding the larvae, they're guards out in the front of the hive, or they're mortuary bees. They'll take dead bees out and dump them. They'll do fanning to regulate the temperature inside the hive. They like to keep the hive at about 92 to 95 degrees inside, so nice and warm. And then the last 3 weeks, they're field bees, and so they're out there foraging for the pollen and nectar, and then they die. And there is the queen. If you didn't see her before, there is a queen in that photo. Okay, again, drones. The drones, their primary mission is just to mate with queens. So, and then after they do that, they die. So it can be kind of a short life for them. But especially in the wintertime, you'll find a lot of drones will get kicked out of the hive because they'll go back to the hive, or they'll be in the hive if they haven't gone out to mate, and they're just eating honey. They're consuming resources, so they're no good. So the worker bees, all the ladies will just kick the drones out, and they'll produce more in spring. It can be a cruel world. So bee stings, yeah, if you want to be a beekeeper, you got to be willing to take a few stings. Most reactions are pretty normal. Kind of look like, they can look like this. Those are normal reactions. Some of them look pretty extreme. The one in the middle is maybe what I get. Sometimes it doesn't even look that bad. Those are normal reactions right there. That's not an allergy. If you're really getting an allergic reaction, it's time to call 911. You're going into anaphylactic shock or something. You might not be able to breathe, you might lose consciousness, that sort of thing. That is a serious condition. But I think it's only about 62 people a year or so can't remember the exact statistics, not many, and that includes deaths from wasps and hornets and things like that. So it's a very rare thing for someone to be truly allergic at this level. You can also get a toxic reaction. This is like if you really were to get hundreds of stings at one time, that might cause some problems too. All right, a little bit on equipment. And I've got some stuff on the table that I can show you. I kind of showed you a smoker earlier. And let me show you a couple other things here, and you come over to the camera. These are hive tools, a couple different types of hive tools, but these help you kind of move inside the hive, pick up frames, and the bees will glue everything together. And so you got to have something to kind of break it all apart and to help lift the frames. And then some people wear gloves. I don't. I just choose not to because it helps me to handle the frames better. And so I'm just careful so I don't crush the bees with gloves on. You can be a little bit clumsier, but a lot of people do, and that's great. And then almost everybody will wear some kind of a jacket and a veil. Probably the most important thing I wear is the jacket and the veil. Okay. And then the frame, we talked about the frames. I've got one on the table here also, but frames, these Langstroth type frames, if you don't have something, they'll just do whatever they want, like the picture on the upper left. But frames kind of help the bees with a pattern. Some of them have foundation, it could be wax or plastic foundation, like the one on the right, upper right, or just the wood frame, and then the bees will make what they need to make, and that works just fine too. And then harvesting, I will tell you, harvesting is messy. It's a lot of fun. I harvest about twice a year. Each time I get about 200 pounds or so. The medium boxes are pretty heavy, 50 some odd pounds there. If you are using deep frames, like these size frames here, a box could weigh about 90 pounds. And you're trying to lift that off your high and get to it. And that's a lot of work and a lot of weight. But you get a lot of honey too. And then this is just an example of, I use an electric heated knife to help take the wax capping off the honey. You put it in an extractor, spin it around, get it all, and then you put it in jars and jar it on up. Last couple slides here. Some bees are not immune to diseases. The worst things that we get typically are like the deformed wing virus and parasitic mite syndrome. These are primarily diseases that are transmitted by what's called a varroa mite, small little bug. That's the varroa mite right there on the back of that bee. Now the mites don't kill the bees, but they're a vector for disease, and the disease is what causes all sorts of problems, and that's how a hive can die out, a colony can die out. Okay, so pollinators. These are bees, or hummingbirds and things like that. Responsible for about 1/3 of all the food that we eat. And just kind of a picture to get a feel for what that would look like. If you took away about 1/3 of the stuff you see at Safeway or something, then that's, it would certainly make a difference. So what can you do to help? Well, one thing is you can, you don't have to have bees, but you can put out some water. You can grow your own pollinator-friendly flowers and vegetables and fruits and that sort of thing. And that's it. So my wife is a teacher, so this is kind of a fun thing to do. All right. I went really fast. That was a lot of information, and I went really fast. So, but I'm happy to. I don't know if we have time, but I'm happy to take some questions.
Oh, that was really good. Is the Augenjoss bee, whatever, Davis still going?
The what at Davis?
Augenjoss supporting the bee study at Davis?
Well, UC Davis is one of the premier, places where bees are studied and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure about that particular activity going on, but they're one of the premier places in the country for study about honeybees and that sort of thing. Watching.
I had a great aunt who just loved royal jelly for her hands. Where's that come from?
So royal jelly is produced, it's secreted by the worker bees. That's what they will feed. Every bee gets a dose of royal bee. It's excreted through from the worker bees into the cell, and every bee gets a little bit of it. But the queen bee, if they're going to create a new queen bee, then the queen bee will get exclusively the royal jelly, and that helps her to grow, all the right reproductive organs and things. So there are some people, and I don't know, I wouldn't have the patience to do this, but they somehow go in there and extract out in each of the little cells the royal jelly, and that's a lot of work to me.
Yeah, they get a lot of money too.
Yeah, it would be very expensive, yes.
What do you do with all your honey?
So most of it goes to family and friends. I have sold some of my honey over at Windmill Farms. If you ever see it over there, it's, this is kind of my label, Colonel A's Bees. And so I don't do that all the time, but that's where if I've got excess, I'll bring a few cases over there. They see me coming when it's local honey, they love it. That stuff flies off the shelf and it's gone in just no time.
And is that your own frame honey separated?
No, I use the Mount Diablo Beekeepers Association. They have that. I don't know who's doing it right now, but Club Secretary Lowe's Kale used to keep that. I'd go to her garage in Concord and extract away. But I think she's no longer the secretary, so I'm not sure who's. Okay, might be. Yeah, Jeff.
So star thistle makes it really good honey.
Star thistle?
Yeah, and do you have any experiments?
I've got at home, I've got about 11 different types of honey, but most of it's store-bought, right? Because I also do classes, I'll offer auction items for a beekeeping experience and a class, and we do, I take them out in the hive, they get in there, play with the bees, we find the queen, do all that, and come inside, we do honey tasting, and I make mead also, we'll do some mead tasting, and just have a fun time of it, but all my honey is just what I call wildflower honey. When you see wildflower honey, that means they have no idea where the bees have been. But if you see something like orange blossom, clover, things like that, very specific manuka honey, these are supposedly they put the hives in where there's a high density of that type of plant that they can gather the nectar from.
How do the bees react after they're put on a semi-truck and transported miles away from where they grew up?
Yeah, they'll actually come to California every February, mid-February. They're coming from Florida, Texas, Mississippi, the Southeast, and they'll make that journey on 18-wheelers. They put them on these trucks, they kind of screen them in. They do just fine. And the forklifts will take them off the trucks, put them out in the fields. You'll see them when you're driving out there in the valley.
Because they miss their own holes when they fly back once a year?
Oh, no, they can't make it, no. As soon as they move to a new location, they'll quickly realize that this isn't our place. And they'll do an orientation flight, and they'll kind of recalibrate their new location based on the sun, based on whatever they see around them. Who knows how they do it, but they'll kind of recalibrate, I'm here, so that when they fly out in the orchard, they know how to get back to where it was, to that same queen and that same hive.
Does every frame have honey and eggs in it? Like I saw kind of a snippet of it, or is it some frames just honey and some frames just eggs?
So these particular frames have a little bit of honey on them on the corners, each of the upper corners. They also have brood in them. So they've got larvae, they've got pupa. Some of those, there's some eggs in there. There's some pollen. If you look close enough, there's some pollen in some of those frames. For honey, what I do, not every beekeeper does it, but what I do is I use what's called a queen excluder. And it's basically a mesh, metal mesh that I put over the brood boxes, and then I put a box on top of that. The worker bees can get up in there and deposit the nectar, but the queen can't make it up in there to lay eggs. And so you get pure honey up above, so it makes it easier to harvest.
Honey never goes bad, does it? It doesn't go bad.
No, it never had any that's gone bad. I'm not aware of any that really goes bad. Now, what you can do though, you can harvest it too soon. If it's not fully capped, it needs to dry out to 17% or so viscosity. And so it comes in much wetter than, much a higher water content. And if you harvest it too soon, then it can, that can spoil and start to ferment. Yeah.
How does the beekeeper know if there's any sick bees? I mean, like, what do they do to find out they have these sick bees in their hive?
Yeah, so you'll see them walking around on the ground. Well, you'll see if they have deformed wing virus, then it definitely, there's deformed wings on them. You can see that. Or this parasitic mite syndrome. There's other things where they just walk around on the ground in circles and they can't get back up in the hive. You know you've got the problem, but so how do you treat it? Well, you need to treat the mites, treat against the mites. And so there's various organic methods and synthetic methods and things like that to kill off the mites. And then hopefully that will save your hive.
What do you think of hop guard?
I've never used Hop Guard. I use primarily Formic Pro. I used to use a lot of oxalic acid, but mostly Formic Pro and Apivar. Yeah, if I have the honey supers on, just the Formic Pro. I don't use Apivar. That's more of almost like a dog collar. It kills off the mites. But Hop Guard is important. I'm sorry.
It's hop.
Formic acid is an organic compound, and so you can have the honey supers on, and it's still okay.
Do you still smoke to this day?
I do. I still use a smoker, and everybody's got their favorite, fuel for the smoker. I typically will use, and here I've got pine needles. And I don't know if you can see that or not, but pine needles work really well for me. You can use the European oat grass off the hills, or you can use almost anything, but some people use burlap or just wood pellets and things like that. I like the pine needles, especially pine needles that have been kind of run over by a car and it's almost like split ends in your hair, but it tends to work a lot better, and it gives a nice, cool, dense white smoke. That calms the bees down.
Infusing them, or what does the smoke actually do?
Yeah, it is sort of, there's some science behind this, and I'm not the science guy, but there's a lot of people that say the smoke, it calms them, but really what it does is it makes them kind of think that there might be a fire coming. And so they dive down into the hive, and then they start gorging on honey because they're thinking that we may have to evacuate the hive. We're going to take some honey with us because if we got to find a new home, we need to have plenty of resources with us. So that's what a lot of entomologists think is going on with the smoke. But it does kind of calm them down, and it also hides the pheromone smell. So bees, when if you're messing with them, they'll get excited, or you're pinching them, they'll let off an alarm pheromone. Bees are very pheromone smell oriented. That's how kind of the queen sends her signal that all is well in the hive. But also if there's an alarm, then they can smell that, and then they get all excited. So the smoke will also hide all of those pheromone smells.
So 10 or 15 years ago, there was a like animated movie and a whole bunch of talk about, oh, the bees are all dying off and it's going to be rolled into 10 years and whatever happened with that. Speaking of science.
Yeah, I don't know, you heard of colony collapse disorder? That might be what you're kind of referring to. That was kind of a big term years ago. I think most people are, maybe it's still a term, but most people are kind of looking to more of the root causes of why are hives really dying. And what we're finding, I think in our area, and most places in North America, the varroa mite is our biggest enemy. And so
one of the things I had heard after the whole movie came out and everything was that some people were harvesting, or some companies, whatever, were harvesting all of the honey and putting in a man-made feed for the bees or something like that, and they pissed the bees off, and they said, well, we're not going to produce. Is that?
yeah, I'm not sure about that, but beekeepers will feed if, in the wintertime, a lot of times, if beekeepers have taken too much honey, that's a sin. Right? Don't take too much honey from the bees, especially in the wintertime. You gotta give them enough to make it through the winter. But if they don't have enough honey to make it through the winter, then or pollen resources inside the hive, then you can feed them pollen patties. These are like almost like candy fondant type patties for the pollen. Or some people use sugar. You can use a kind of a 1-to-1 type syrup, sugar syrup, simple syrup kind of mixture, things like that to make sure they have enough food. But they don't reject that. They, if they don't need it, they won't use it. If they need it, then they'll consume it.
Where do they go to the bathroom at? In the honey?
The what?
They go to the bathroom on the honey?
No, they will actually go on cleansing flights. And they will leave the hive, and they'll go out, and if you see little yellow droplets, that's bee poop. But that's what they do. It's what we all do. Manuka is very expensive. I want to say that's the tea tree. Is what Manuka comes from. Yeah, down from Australia, New Zealand area. Yeah, and I think it might be more a lot of marketing, and as well as the logistics of kind of getting it to North America.
It's getting ice cream.
It's good stuff.
I got a question about the floats they make out of all the flowers. I mean, with all these flower boats, floats that they make. Wouldn't they have more bees because they need those flowers?
For like parade floats? Yeah, I'm not sure I can really draw a correlation between parade float flowers and beekeeping, although there may be some. I'm not sure.
Okay.
We did it.
We did it.
All right, thank you very much.
Mark, when I saw your presentation last August, you really improved it. This is a much better presentation. Thank you so much. That was good. This is better. Okay, couple things. One, our next program will be in May, and Christian is working with a guy by the name of Alan Frank. And Alan I think he lives in Livermore, and he's going to be talking about some of the more notorious aspects of this Livermore, Amador Valley. Now I'll think of that. And so, and Alan actually spoke to us back in 2013. Maybe you remember it. He had a wonderful title, The Curse of Dead Cow Curve. About this continental world. So Alan's very good. Let's see if he can top that with a better title for this one coming up. Beverly, I think, has some announcements for it. Beverly, you like make me an announcement?
Just that there's a new exhibit at the Museum Gadgets galore, and those of you who are a little older are going to recognize some of the older items that are there, and they talk about how inventions changed our lives. So, like, from cream separators to,
It's a fun exhibit, so come visit the museum and you'll probably see some stuff. You remember when you were a kid, and then somebody was like, what the hell is that stuff? You won't recognize it at all.
we're gonna recognize it.
It
It may be in your kitchen.
Okay, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to have you tonight. Hi.